and please join us. And I would like to welcome now Mr. David Bernstein, founder and CEO of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Mr. Bernstein is a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas. He's the past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and former executive director of the David Project. He's the author of the forthcoming book that I saw back there, Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. Please, Mr. Bernstein.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here among friends. Really happy to be part of this distinguished panel, especially someone I've admired my entire adult life, Alan Dershowitz, who I've been reading since I was a college student. It's really an honor to be on the panel with you. So, a friend of mine who's a historian cautions never to talk about the era that you think you're going in. Leave it to us historians to do that. But I'm going to violate that precept for a moment and say that I think we are entering into a very ideological era that's reminiscent of the earliest 20th century, where communism and fascism and ideas like that had taken hold in massive swaths of the globe. I think we're entering a time in America where ideologies are once again these simplistic ideas that of what explains where we are and how we live are now all the rage. On the right, we have this idea of replacement theory, or the Great Replacement. This absurd idea that immigrants are taking over American society and that Jews are playing an important role in bringing in these aliens to replace ordinary Americans. We're seeing a sort of a unique ideology take hold among certain segments of the black community, black nationalist community that you've heard recently from Kanye West and Kyrie Irving and others. And we're seeing an ideology that shall not be named, but we are going to name it here, woke ideology, which you've heard about. It's very hard to talk about woke ideology in the US and among American Jews. It's a lot easier to talk about in places like this, in Israel, and I'm so delighted that groups like Reut are playing a leadership role in raising awareness of these ideological trends and are helping us in America name the ideology that shall not be named. So what is this ideology? What is woke ideology? What is radical social justice ideology? What is critical race ideology? It holds two key tenets. One, that bias and oppression are not just a matter of personal attitude, but are embedded in the very systems and structures of society. And two, that only those who have experienced that oppression, that bias, have the insight and the qualification to describe it, define it for the rest of society. So you'll hear people say that only black people get to describe oppression against blacks, and only Jews get to describe oppression against Jews, get to define anti-Semitism for the rest of society. The problem is that that second tenet is often weaponized as a way of shutting down discourse. It's a way of saying that you don't have the standing to share your opinion about societal issues, and that's inherently illiberal. But it's also used, that ideology, that weaponized ideology, is also used to promote ideas that we would think of as potentially anti-Semitic. And I want to explain how that's so. So my son, my younger son, who's 17 years old, is learning about, in social studies, that to recognize and resist systems of oppression. That's what the new Montgomery County, Maryland social studies curriculum is doing. Now, you might say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with learning about systems of oppression? The problem is people are telling you exactly who's oppressed and who the oppressor is. It comes packaged with an ideology of who's oppressed and who's oppressor. In this worldview, success is conflated with oppression. If you're successful, if you're part of a group that is above the mean, you will be perceived as an oppressor group. And so you can imagine, even if the idea of Jews and Israel and Zionism are never mentioned, Over time, we are conditioning young people and we're conditioning to society to understand Jews in Israel in a very specific way as part of the oppressor class. That's what will come about. This ideology is also, as others have said, inherently illiberal. It is anti-democratic in nature. It tries to shut down our ability to have conversations. And the more illiberal American society becomes, the more crazy it becomes. Professor Jonathan Haidt often talks about structural stupidity that we're seeing in American society. The more crazy, the more stupid collectively we become, the more anti-Semitic we become as well. And so we've got to guard against that. And by the way, the more we see it on the left, the more crazy the left becomes, the more crazy the right becomes as well. Another key aspect of this ideology is it erases what's unique about Jews. It demands that we give up a part of ourselves. And now Wilf likes to say that we pay our pound of flesh to it. So among Jewish students, it might be renouncing our Zionism. Among Jewish organizations that are used to being part of coalitions, it might be acknowledging that America is a white supremacist society. In other words, it's no longer enough to be part of social changes and to try to support issues like criminal justice reform. One must now pay the political price, the price of admission, and say that America, this country that represents some of the greatest ideals of humanity, is a white supremacist, oppressive country. That's what's being demanded of us. And people like me are now saying we should not pay that price of admission. It advances this notion of equity that Professor Dershowitz talked about, this idea that anytime a group is not proportionally represented in any field, it is prima facie evidence that there's discrimination. But if you say that, if you argue that that's the case, then only those people, not only is it the case that the people below the mean are discriminated against, but anybody above the mean is automatically part of the oppressor class or is complicit in the supremacy that is bringing about the conditions that the people below the mean are facing. That's going to obviously affect Jews in many ways. And we're just now starting to see that play out in public discourse and in university admissions and in other aspects of American life. Another thing it does, this ideology does, is it downgrades anti-Semitism to a mere whine that the Jews might have. You hear this idea of that anytime Jews in let's say a diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting raise anti-Semitism to be discussed, they are decentering blackness or anti-blackness. We saw this in a case that my colleague Elisa Lewin is working on at Stanford, where a Stanford psychiatrist who raised anti-Semitism in meetings was told that they were taking the spotlight off of racism. So you're not allowed to talk about anti-Semitism even when it's as obvious as Nazi swastikas being placed on a Zoom meeting. That's still removing the spotlight from somebody else's oppression. And the last way, and there probably are more that I'm not mentioning, is that this ideology, unlike any other ideology that that sparks anti-Semitism, makes it impossible to talk, or harder to talk about than it should be. It is the root of cancel culture, so people are afraid to speak of it. They're afraid to speak about how it causes anti-Semitism. Jews, mainstream American Jews, are afraid to speak about how it causes anti-Semitism. I love the quote that, Susan, that you gave from Jonathan Greenblatt, that anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane, and on the left is like climate change. But then what are the CO2 emissions that are producing that climate change on the left? It is the ideology that we're too scared of naming. And I was delighted that my friend and colleague, William Deroff, really didn't just talk about anti-Semitism on the left, just talk about the symptoms, but talked about the ideological underpinnings of that we're starting to see. That's what has to happen. We can't fight something that we won't name. Thank you. So I just, a couple of data points. How are we doing? Okay. So I'll just say that the others have talked about the data that we've seen. There is data now on this. We conducted a poll of 1,600 likely voters, and we can now say that the more woke somebody is, the more likely they are going to hold certain negative views of Jews. And I'm really delighted that Fern is going to be doing some more research on that. We need more research on this. But I want to end with just a quick thought about what's next for us. And I know my friend Iran from Reut said, don't talk about solutions to this. So I know others will talk about it. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that we need to think about repositioning the American Jewish community in the American body politic. It doesn't mean we have to go from left to right, but there are all kinds of allies. Professor Dershowitz talked about Asian Americans who share our fundamental positioning in American society. They are our new friends, and we have not yet gotten to know them yet. So I think that that's one thing we've got to think about. Who are the people who are supporting democracy, who are opposing extreme ideologies on both sides of the political spectrum? They are our friends, and we've got to take steps to get to know them. Thank you.